if psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
There is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme.
And I think there's an element of truth to
Because
this.
I have something interesting later in the show that will make you feel very weird. From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville. We have a great show for you. Our trending topic today is the Oscars. But first, we're going to meet our Charlotte panel. Hello, Emma Kate. How are you?
Hi, Dave. I'm doing very well.
Are you typically an Oscar watcher?
Oh, yes. I love the Oscars for the fashion, and I also really enjoy just making fun of the whole production.
Yeah, it's a pretty good thing to make fun of, for sure. I don't get the whole fashion thing because I don't get fashion in real life, obviously.
I would have never guessed that.
The rest of it, I definitely like to make fun of. And Dr. Frank Gaskell's here. Hello, Frank.
Hello, Davey.
Are you an Oscar watcher?
I do watch the Oscars, but I usually don't watch the entire thing. I do like the pre-Oscar show.
Why? Because they talk to the stars on the red carpet?
Because of the fashion. I'm all
there
about
it
the
is.
fashion.
The fashion. Frank
Right.
loves. Frank's got the little part of your brain that understands the
Women's
ladies'
clothes.
fashion thing.
That's
Women's
right.
clothes.
That's right.
That's
I don't
it.
wear it, but I get it.
Who's to say
So
he
says
does
you.
or he doesn't?
We don't know.
Who's to say? Well, you just heard Jonathan Hederle. He's our certified Asian. He rounds out the panel. Jonathan, I know you watch the Oscars for sure.
And definitely not for the fashion.
For other reasons, maybe having to do with the movies. We'll talk about that in our second segment. But first, each week, Jonathan trolls around the internet. He finds a great story of psychology in the news for the first segment that we call
Being Human.
So Ted Bundy is all over the media right now with the Netflix documentary show Conversations with the Killer and the Zac Efron film Making Waves. Well, what about female serial killers? A recent study looked at sex differences in serial murderers and found that male serial killers more frequently act as hunters, stalking and killing targeted strangers in dispersed areas, while female serial killers more frequently are gatherers, killing those who are around them and familiar to them, and gaining profit from their crimes. So, Frank, as our resident Frank, what do you make of the sex differences amongst serial killers?
I totally buy it. I'd never really thought of it because you don't really hear about female serial killers. But they did match up 55 subjects. They had to go back to the 1800s to find them all. But they matched up by age of their first kill. And if you look at most of the video games that girls play, it's more of a gathering type process. And boys are about conquering territory, and this is the same thing. The men are going out and hunting just like a hunter would, and the women, imagining they stay back with the tribe, they have to gather resources to kind of continue their DNA, and so they're going to kill something nearby that they can steal from. Makes perfect sense. And it explains all these movies, too, of how the serial killer women operate.
Well, I know apparently the movie Monster was not a classic serial killer for females, but typically money is a primary factor as a motivator for serial killers. But for men, it's slightly different. So women, it's money, but men, it's also money, but power, control, humiliation, and
weird sex.
Right. And one of the weird things that I was looking into at this is that the brains of sociopaths and serial killers have been studied, and one of the researchers actually discovered that they had a serial killer in their family's background, and it's about low orbital cortex activity, which is essentially where ethical behavior is thought to reside in the brain, decision-making, impulse control, and so these people are less able to inhibit or suppress behaviors like violence, sex, those sorts of things.
Well, to me, this reeks of like gender stereotypes, but I buy it because when you think about murdering another person, that is one of the most primitive ways of dealing with conflict, either external or internal conflict. So the idea that they fall into these very narrow and rigid gender stereotypes is not that surprising to me because, with you talked about the brain of serial killers or sociopaths. When you think about somebody killing for profit, they feel insecure about their ability to be taken care of. They feel like there's competition with others, or for men, if they're feeling so significantly rejected or had a traumatic upbringing that they don't have other kind of coping mechanisms to deal with, everyday disappointments and difficulties in life that other people can.
And I read some of the earlier research from this 2019 study that we're talking about, and the earlier one talked about how typically the female serial killers are white, educated, and have been married. They're also usually in a caregiver role or a mother, and typically poison is the way that they go about killing people.
So, Emma Kate, you have to go on record with this.
Okay.
Of the four of us, and we'll leave Sean and Mariel out for now, but of the four of us, who do you think is most likely to be a serial killer to least likely? Put them in order from most likely to least likely.
I think Hedderly is the most likely. And then
Okay.
I think Frank is the least likely because he would, A, get caught, so he would never be able to follow through on like a multiple, so it'd just be like a one-time murderer.
Man,
But
not very nice.
I mean, it's true, though. You'd get so nervous. Like, imagine being questioned or interviewed by the police. Just
I'm
imagine.
done.
Yeah, exactly. He couldn't do it.
I'm just trying to imagine Frank overpowering anything or
No,
anyone.
I wouldn't do it that way. I'd do it many other ways. I'd do it.
It would be like an accidental death, but then you would, like, turn it into, this is the kind of person I am. I'm going to just kill everyone now.
But
Frank,
you think
same question.
I'm the most likely, huh? Okay.
I think it would be Hedderly, Dave, Emma Kate, and me.
Huh.
Actually, I'd reverse. Dave, I'd put you number one, Hedderly number two.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really? Why?
Well, because you get all OCD and obsessive, and you'd be like, that's one, I need to do another one. And it's like you're creating a little collection, and you'd take pictures and dress them up and do all that stuff.
Well,
Dress
the
'em up.
dispersed areas is another thing. And Dave, you've been living in a couple of places, Charlotte and Nashville. So
Billy?
It's true.
Yeah, he's got to keep moving on to get
Yeah,
a bigger pack
cover
of
the tracks.
victims.
What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I wish I could say someone other than myself, but of the four of us, I probably would be the most likely in terms of that emotional detachment that I'm able to experience. Then I think Emma Kate. Then I think Frank, and then I think Dave.
Me? Really?
Yeah.
I do too. I would say
I'm shocked.
I would say you're second on the list.
Really?
Yeah.
She seemed so
Ooh.
pleased.
Yeah, I think it would be Jonathan, Emma Kate, and then probably Frank, and then me.
Yeah, I think Frank, where Dave comes in last versus you is when you study serial killers. There's usually a significant traumatic childhood or neglect.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
So I think you have almost all of us beaten in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But with your emotionality, I think that's really where I leapfrog you.
right.
Well, yeah, and it could be that Frank does his first kill out of pure raw emotion, and then he's like breached that threshold, and it's like, oh, that worked. I got away with it, and then it's other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd put him a little ahead of me. Well, if you have questions or comments about this fine conversation, we hope you'll write us at shrinktank.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let's move on to our trending topic, which is the Oscars. And they're coming up pretty soon, but I want to tell you that we don't want to so much work around the predictions this episode and more talk about just the cultural relevance of the Oscars, what the Oscars tell us about where things are culturally, some of the psychology of awards and that kind of thing. So the big news, of course, is Kevin Hart is not going to host, and then fairly recently, a couple weeks ago, the Oscars officially said we will have no host. First time in 30 years, second time in history, I believe. So what do you think this means in terms of the decision for that? Obviously, it was a reaction to the Kevin Hart situation. Any thoughts about what this means about where we are culturally and where the Oscars fit into that?
I'm very, very angry about it. I think it's stupid, petty, and it shows that a lack of acknowledgement that people can change. There's no forgiveness, and it's just a continuation of this culture of all bad things are equal. You do this bad thing, it's all bad, and I'm going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I can't stand it. I was listening to another show about Carson. I mean, Carson was a wife beater, and they still let him do the show. And I don't get it at all.
Yeah, because if we let a wife beater do it, why can't we let anybody? Come on.
Well, I feel like we talked a lot about this on our recent call-out episode, highlighting the Kevin Hart controversy. And again, what Frank mentioned is so critical. There are certain things that are truly not excusable, like murder, which we just talked about. But I feel that growth and change is so important to be taken into account. We need to be doing that, and we're simply not. And Kevin Hart, in my opinion, and I know I'm not part of that marginalized community, but in my opinion, he was genuine in the past mistakes that he made and owning that, but it still wasn't enough for him to have just said sorry. It's like he didn't say sorry enough. And so then my prediction is that this particular Oscars is going to be more of that call-out culture. It's just going to be people tearing people down, and I don't want that. I hope it's more about using the platform to foster hope and for positive change.
I mean, I think the Kevin Hart thing we've already talked through, and I have some different perspective than maybe others, but I think it's just a snapshot of a larger dilemma the Oscars finds itself in. 15, 20 years ago, it was the biggest show in town. And now you have the Golden Globes, you have all these other award shows, you have critics in major cities hosting their own awards, and so there's an oversaturation of celebrating and rewarding that I think it in some ways has diminished the impact that Oscars has as a viewing experience, not as the gold standard of awards, because everybody still in the film community, they aspire to win or be nominated for an Oscar. That is really what's going to build careers. That's what's going to increase their revenue and what they can earn in the film industry. So it's still the gold standard in terms of praise and accolades. But as a viewing experience, the award show itself, it really is caught between a rock and a hard place, because the Golden Globes, which I think are really irrelevant and irreverent, they can have fun, they can drink and be tipsy, and that's kind of fun to watch, where the Oscars is really about prestige, and that can really be, for a lot of people, a very boring exercise when you think that when we make YouTube videos, anything over 3 minutes, people lose interest. You're talking about a 3.5 hour award show. That's tough.
You take that same idea, and the Oscars, as the Academy has really hurt themselves about this, because they have 24 categories, and as far as I understand, their bylaws require all 24 to be broadcast. Now, the Grammys have, whatever it is, 100 in some categories. If they had to broadcast all those, they'd be on for 3 days straight. But they wisely pick and choose. They always have, album of the year, record of the year, and that kind of thing. And then they kind of rotate which other ones they feature on the telecast. The Oscars, whether it's editing, costuming, makeup. They have to air all that stuff. And to be real honest, as great as that stuff is in terms of accomplishment, nobody wants to watch it. Nobody does. And now that it's not the only game in town, you're really talking about a show that is going to stretch 3.5 hours, that has in our culture, with the attention span that it has and with the other alternatives that it has, isn't going to hang with that.
So I might be in the minority here, Dave, but I actually love seeing the writers and the costume designers actually get that moment, because they never get recognition. And the reality is, yes, the star is doing a lot of the heavy lifting to an extent for the success of a film, but in order for that film to be a good film, there are so many other people working behind the scenes that I think I love watching those people.
I feel so bad for that other Oscar party where the technical crew and all those people are, and you see the photo of them. It's like, oh, that's sad. You couldn't go to the real one. You had to go to the nerd one.
Does that hit too close to home for
little
you,
bit.
Frank?
A little.
And it's a very awkward viewing experience, because I agree with them and Kate. They get their moment, and then they are played off within 35 seconds that you really can't enjoy that. You have to rush up there and as quickly as possible try to thank as many people as possible, and then say something poignant to your family and loved ones. It's really awkward watching.
Well, I will say this. As a writer, I love anytime writers get rewarded and celebrated. But really, what I'm talking about is not the recognition of those people, because I agree that sound design and all the technical aspects really make movies the movie that it is. I'm really talking about the wisdom of having a 3.5 hour show where you're showing these sort of these awards going to categories and to people that no one really has any connection to. And whether that's a wise thing moving forward. There might be a way to feature it, to show the person in a small clip or something, but unless they get this show down to under 3 hours, I think they're going to increasingly lose their audience. I just think it's going to be a slow suicide if they don't figure that out.
They need to get rid of the thing where they talk about all the actors who died, because when I was young and watching it, I thought, oh, okay, wonder who that was. And now it's people dying, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's getting a little close to my age. I'm not a big fan of that.
Hey. Yeah. So here's a final question about this. Do you think that this kind of culture of giving awards is a good thing? And I will say one argument would be, you've got a bunch of narcissistic millionaires who are giving each other awards, and that just is a extension of our narcissistic culture. The other side of it is, anytime that you incentivize people to work really hard, whether it's in sports, in the arts, any of the things that really enhance and enrich our culture, when you have something like that really people aspire to do hard work and good work for, that becomes a good thing. Any thoughts about this?
I guess I'll comment first. I like the fact that we can use this sort of positive reinforcement. So they are getting this award where people who maybe never would have had an opportunity, like the small films that make it somehow to the Oscars and get that nomination, that it then catapults them to another level. So it's more about the clout, I think, that comes with the accolade, but that's my opinion.
I think you said it best, Emma Kate. I don't believe I can say it any better than you have said. I am acting now.
Please don't act.
Set it
Wow. Don't do that ever again. I think the upsides greatly outweigh the downside of award giving. But I do think the Academy is attempting to make strides in even representation in the Academy members. So 10, 15 years ago, when it was predominantly middle-aged white men that were a part of the Academy and the voting bloc, it might have felt a little bit more exclusive, a boys' club, or self-congratulatory. But now that you see the Academy has opened it up to younger members and members of representation, I think it's really important for Latino filmmakers, filmmakers of color, female writers and directors, that when they create art, that it is celebrated and that people recognize the artistic merit that it is. And I think the next wave will be writers and critics to have representation there for people to dissect and analyze film and art through a cultural lens that maybe hasn't been as well established in years past.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think on balance, it's probably in the plus column. I mean, it is, I think in some ways we do have that sort of narcissistic vibe going on with all these award shows. But in the ultimate sense, when we're doing something that makes a person want to create films that are artful and good, and they aspire to, like their dream is to win an Oscar, and it makes them work harder for that, that's nothing but a good thing. And a culture that recognizes art is also good. So I think that's a cool thing. Any last thoughts about the Oscars before we wrap it up?
Part of the reason, Dave, I didn't want to talk about the films themselves this year is I haven't seen that many of them. And part of the reason I haven't seen that many of them is because I really feel like my enthusiasm for the films that are up for major awards has been pretty muted this year. Most of the movies that I really love this year are not represented in the nominations. And so I kind of think it was a down year for movies, at least ones that we tend to associate with Oscar pedigree.
I would totally agree. I've seen all 9 Best Picture nominations. I've seen most of the films with acting nominations. I don't think in the Best Picture category there's a single great film, all-time great one, in the mix of those. I think there are probably 2 all-time great films from the year, and neither of them were nominated for Best Picture this year. But I would agree. I think it's a down year. There's some good stuff in there. There's some definitely good films in there, but maybe not a great one for this year.
I would argue that the category this Academy season that has the highest quality of films is the animated feature. You have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, you have Isle of Dogs, you have Incredibles 2. Like, to me, Spider-Man was a fantastic movie, and those other animated films are just high quality. Like, that's really the only movie that probably made my top 10 that's well represented this year's in the nominations.
Yeah, Spider-Man is one of the 2 great movies of the year in my mind. That's one of the 2. The other one I've talked about here before is called American Animals. No one talks about it. No one's seen it. I love it. But the one that did get a little bit of Oscar loving was Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. A great movie. I think it'll hold up fantastically well. All right, our final segment is something that we call our doctor's orders, and these are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture that we want to recommend to you. So we'll start with Emma Kate.
So I am behind the ball on this recommendation, but I just started watching The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel from Amazon. I'm a few episodes in it, but I love it. It is hilarious and very enjoyable and just kind of an upbeat fluff sort of thing for me to watch. And I think you should definitely check it out.
Jonathan.
This show, it's on Netflix. And so obviously I've been watching a lot of Netflix lately. I recommended it to Frank. It wasn't his cup of tea, but there is a Korean zombie show called Kingdom. And it takes place probably several hundred years in the past. And in the midst of a family feud for the kingdom, a zombie outbreak happens. And it's really a fusion of zombies and vampires, in that during the daytime, the zombies go dormant, which leads to a lot of poor decision-making when they think they're just corpses, only to discover as soon as the sun goes down, those corpses come alive and they do their zombie thing. So it is a slow burner. It reminds me a lot of the first couple seasons of The Walking Dead, in that it's really more about atmosphere than it is about quick action. But if you like the first season of Walking Dead, I would encourage you to at least check it out. It's called Kingdom.
And my recommendation is something that I recommend probably once, maybe twice a year, but the new season of Survivor has started. That's a show that in my mind holds up. It's a great show for everybody, for adults, for whole families. It's a show that I think has stood the test of time. It will be regarded as a classic all-timer, and I think this season is setting up well. So
Absolutely.
I recommend Survivor to you.
Love
and that's
it.
going to
2
do
thumbs
it
up.
for this edition of the Shrink Tank podcast. We hope you'll check out shrinktank.com for great articles and videos. You can also find links to our Doctor's Orders products. You can follow us on Twitter at shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. For questions or comments, drop us a note. Our email is feedback@shrinktank.com. And if you like the show, please give us a review on iTunes. It helps build our audience, and we greatly appreciate it. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright, Jonathan Hedderly, and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.